With great pleasure and honor, I want to welcome to the show the elite performance coach, Andy O'Brien.
How's it going, Matt?
Fantastic. Yourself?
Very good. Very good. Just, getting through some technical difficulties and we're ready to rock here.
I was just telling you before we came on live that I'm going to give you the award for the most patient man ever.
Sweet. Yeah, I don't know if my clients would agree with you that I'm the most patient guy, but I guess today I am. So it's all good.
You must have had your chai tea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm all grounded.
That's right, eh? All your meditation before coming on. So so you're from PEI, Andy, correct?
I am. Yeah, born and raised. Grew up in PEI. Good maritimer.
Unbelievable. And you got your start in this industry, like you just had a passion for, training and performance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, going back 20 years now, believe it or not, I started when I was pretty young, about 18 years old. And this is like pre-internet, so there wasn't a whole lot of resources. I mean, the amount of information you have today is crazy. I can remember actually like physically trading VHS cassettes with people, and, you would go and actually talk to people in various gyms that are literally like gurus, that people had limited access to, and they would pull out some, secret VHS tape that few people had ever seen, and they'd show you stuff. And that was a different world back then. But yeah, I can remember finding, information in the early internet days, or going to libraries and digging things out. And it just felt like I could pursue that learning for hours and hours without really getting fatigued. So I knew it was something that I loved to do. And, I've been very fortunate to be able to make a career out of it.
When you had your start in the industry at the very beginning ages, like what was your inspiration, your passion to pursue with so much, I would say, mastery in your craft? What was that inspiration to do that?
I think having been an athlete myself, I was never really an unbelievable performer in any sport, but I was a pretty good performer in a lot of different sports. And I think just learning as an athlete, that process of applying your mind and learning different ways to train and prepare yourself and having a taste for that, I think that really led me to really just kind of pursue it more, I think, as a professional and start helping other athletes. And ironically, I remember when I was pretty young, I was probably about 7 years old, I saw the movie Rocky IV. And, that was actually the first exposure I had of sort of the scientific application of training. And I just remember the Russians with the lab coats on and all the cool technology, and being inspired by that, thinking, wow, that's cool. They're applying their minds, to figure out and strategize, to the best of their capabilities to ultimately achieve their goal. And then on the other side, you had the concept of the inspiration that Rocky had and being an underdog. And, I remember that training montage from that video so vividly and watched it so many times that was just a really cool inspiration, I think, for me as an athlete. And then, later on, I think I often went back and reflected upon that as really the first kind of exposure I ever had to it.
Interesting. So when you kind of grew up in the industry of kind of evolving from PEI, which really is people don't know what PEI is, maybe from they're listening from the US or whatever, it's a very small province. How big is your province, by the way, just so everyone knows?
Oof, it's not very big. I don't know what it'd be comparatively, but I mean, you can drive tip to tip inside of 3 hours, and there's really only about 150,000 people there. So it's pretty small, but I think it lent itself to certain advantages. I think it's a community where everyone knows one another, everyone supports one another. So for me, starting out, I wanted to train athletes, and that was a novel concept, but a lot of people there got behind me and believed in me and gave me an opportunity to guide them. And, that sort of was the beginnings of, what I was able to do. And I think that was just a big part of the community there. It's been really interesting. I had a chance, one of the cool things about working with the Penguins and winning Stanley Cup is you get to participate in this cool tradition that the NHL has of allowing the staff to have a day with the cup, which is pretty cool. And it's humbling, obviously the players are the ones that are ultimately out there winning it, but to be a part of that and to be included and to have your name on it and, to get that experience was a really, really neat thing for me. And it made me appreciate all that the Stanley Cup does for people of the communities through Canada and the U.S. and even into Europe. And that trophy just is a big deal for a lot of people. So to be able to take it back to PEI and show it to people and have them kind of share in what I was able to go through, especially, since that was the community where I kind of got my start, and there were a lot of people that believed in me as a young kid doing something different and something new. And so, yeah, limitations of being in a small town, but a lot of advantages as well.
So what do you think was the catapult for you that drove you from that? Because it's a small town, like you're a small town guy. So growing from the small town and catapulting into training the world's most elite athletes, that's a huge stepping stone here. So what was the catapult for that?
Well, I think it was, when I started working with Sidney, I was 3 years into my career and knew a fraction of the information that I know now. I don't look at me working with him as an accomplishment per se, just because he's a great athlete. Those are his accomplishments more so than mine, but I look at it more as a learning experience. And so just the ability to have observed somebody who's so successful, and getting a firsthand look at what it is that makes him successful. How does he differentiate himself? What are some of the characteristics and the qualities that he has as an athlete and a competitor? That's just been a great learning experience for me. So if anything, I've been able to take that and offer that experience to other athletes, and then just as somebody who spent like countless hours with him, guide him and provide him advice along the way. And that experience really drove me. I felt privileged to have that opportunity, and I wanted to make sure that the service I was giving him was worthy of the opportunity. So I, the studying and the ability for me to push myself, I think, was always there. But even more so when you have an opportunity to work with somebody like that, the pressure that I had to make sure he stayed healthy, to make sure that he accomplished his goals, which are extremely high. I mean, he sets the bar very high for himself. So anything short of being the best and being the best consistently just doesn't work for an athlete at that level. So that was pressure on me. I couldn't leave any stone unturned. I couldn't do anything any less than what I felt was the best possible service. And that's just, I actually really recommend that to a lot of young athletes or young strength and conditioning coaches. If you can put yourself in a situation where you have high expectations placed on you because of the athletes and the situation they're in, that makes you better. It forces you to learn at a really fast rate. It forces you to be accountable. And it forces you to get results, because I think sometimes we kind of get lost in methodologies and theories, and we don't necessarily have to be held accountable and responsible to getting good results with our athletes. And having worked with some real elite people has forced me to really get those results, whether those results are measured in terms of their health or their performance. I think to be accountable to that is something that makes you a better coach.
So what you're saying, so how do you as a coach, an elite level coach, raise your standards so much? Is it because Sidney's helping you raise the bar, or how do you continually evolve yourself where you're always raising the bar in your coaching and your performance to be at the level like Sidney or John or Nathan or these guys that are like, high level athletes that you're training?
I think it's twofold. Like I think I touched on it before. If you're in a situation where anything short of getting results or anything short of achieving, high level of standard of your service is going to show up in some way for you and become a problem. So whether that's going to lead to the loss of a client, right, or whether that's going to lead to maybe a failed performance or somebody to have to reflect back and say, hey, I don't think this method's really working for me. I think to be in that situation, you're really forced to be at your best, I think is a healthy thing. And I think the second thing is, which applies, Matt, to any career. I think if you love what you're doing and you're inspired to continuously be better at it year after year, day after day, you're going to have success. I think it would be hard for me to have put in the hours that I've put in and to go through the things I've gone through if I didn't love it, because it just ends up being a lot of work. It's not always the most glorious work either. It's a lot of difficult relationships to manage, a lot of difficult problems to solve. And I think if you really enjoy the process and you're passionate about it, that comes a little easier than if you're trying to force yourself through it just because it's your job.
Can you explain in brief the difference between let's say a Sidney mindset compared to a sub-level athletic mindset, and what it took for him to be so successful when you were helping coach him and train him and all these kind of things, compared to those sub-level guys that are trying to, make it to the next level?
Well, I think there's a variety of things. and I look at Sidney as the ultimate competitor, even at the NHL level, where there are other arguably successful athletes that are winning championships and winning, winning scoring titles. To me, his level of consistency at which he does what he does is at a higher level. There are some athletes that they're up and down with their consistency in their production, and then there are some athletes that the process behind their production is an easier process, and they gravitate to an easier process, whether that's related to their off-ice preparation, whether that's related to the type of things that they do on the field or on the ice or in the pool or wherever that might be. His process is a hard process. There's no corners that he cuts. There's no days that he misses. There's no easy workouts. There's none of that, and he never really looks for that or asks for it. He never complains when things are difficult. He really embraces the hard. That's kind of one of the terms we use around our team, embrace the hard. He embraces the adversity. He embraces all of that because he views it as a way of separating himself. So that's the one thing, is just that his consistency, I think, comes back to his process and his willingness to put himself through that difficult process day in and day out. That's just different than other athletes, who really have a limit in terms of how far they're willing to go with that, how many sacrifices they're willing to make. Wherever he needs to be, whatever number of workouts he needs to do, that's just what he needs to do. And he never really builds that around convenience. Right. And the second thing, too, that I've noticed with him is he sets the bar really high in terms of his expectations. And very similar to a lot of great athletes that I've met or that have been around, they have this tendency to be very, very uncomfortable with anything underneath that bar. So anything underneath that bar essentially gives them a fever. It makes them very uncomfortable. So if you have an athlete whose goal is to get 40 goals, there's some guys that will think, well, I got 32. Like, that's still a pretty good year, or my goal was this, I got that. I think we did okay. And what I've noticed with the really, really elite athletes is it's not okay. So they have an idea in mind of what they want to accomplish, and anything short of that is so uncomfortable to them that they're willing to do anything to create change in their process or in their path. So if you're halfway to your goal and you feel like it hasn't come quickly enough or it's not on target, their resources, their attention becomes completely directed around, what do I need to change? Do I need to practice more? Do I need to practice harder? Do I need to change my strategy? There's this ongoing awareness of where they are in relation to that goal. And if they're not on target, there's no excuses. There's no taking your foot off the gas. There's just this constant pursuit of it. And so I think that's, he's a talented hockey player, but there's a lot of talented hockey players. And really what separates him, in my opinion, is his willingness to accept that process, the adversity and the work, and then also his lack of willingness to accept a poor result. He's just not willing to be okay with that. And those are the two things that really stand out for me.
Do you mind sharing a bit, Andy? Do you mind if I call you Andy at all?
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
yep.
Cool. Like when you look at someone like Sidney, because most people look at Sidney or even look at yourself as a coach, they don't realize how much work and time and energy you put into your craft. It's unbelievable. So do you mind giving a little briefing on both Sidney and yourself and what you have to do daily, like some of the basic habits you're involved in, things you have to keep up with that really allow you to, actually push you to that mastery level to be world-class?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I think it's working hard and working smart. I think you got to be willing to put in some time. And so for me, I work with a team, but I also have a lot of responsibilities in my business and to manage this business on the side and to help our team with their training. It's 7 days a week for me in the off season. So, the off season for a lot of people is vacation, it's golf, it's time to do things, from the day that we end to the day that we start up our next season. I'm working 7 full days every single week in between. So that's a little different than what most people are comfortable with. But to me, that's just necessary. I feel like I need to do it that way. And maybe that's not sustainable long term, but I think you just have to be willing to make some sacrifices along the way. And that's just one example for me. The other might be some late nights or fitting in a learning opportunity when there might not be time for it. So I think just that hunger and the drive, has to be central to that. And I see the same thing with athletes. Sometimes it's, I'll have an athlete ask me for a program, and I'll say, look, in order to do it justice, I really need to spend 3 or 4 days with you in person. And that might mean they need to fly from BC to Toronto, or need to fly down to Pittsburgh, or need to come to Halifax, or wherever it might be. And the ones that are really successful, they're willing to do that because that's what is prioritized in their life. If somebody says, here's what you have to do to be successful, the less successful guys say, okay, well, I'm not quite willing to do that. So could you just send it, what's the next best thing? Could you send it in the mail, or can I send you a few videos, or how can I maybe do it so it's more convenient for me? And so I noticed that the really elite ones are not always focused on their convenience. They're focused on what's necessary to be successful. So that's really a big one. And then I think sometimes we have some athletes, and even for myself as a professional, you have to work smart and you have to be efficient with what you're doing. So just constantly grinding and putting in hours isn't always necessarily the best way. I think you always want to revisit what you're doing. You want to have some form of active analysis. I use the word KPIs a lot, or key performance indicators. What are the things that you need to be doing that actually help give you an indication that you're successful, and constantly revisiting those metrics. I definitely think for athletes, there are hard workers that maybe are doing a lot of work that's not necessarily helping them. So just revisiting that overall structure that they have in their strategy, and making sure that that's a smart strategy and it's working for them is an important part also.
How important would you say, when it comes to your high-level athletes, how important is the collaboration of your incredible training you have these guys go through, as opposed to their psychology and their mindset? Like, how important what is the balance of those two components of their performance?
I think it's important from a collaboration standpoint. At the end of the day, some athletes are younger athletes. They need a lot more guidance. So there's a lot more, me to them, or trainer to athlete type of information. And then others are a lot further along, and I have to rely on their guidance in terms of how they feel, and in terms of what they're feeling day to day, or I'm reading off of them in terms of evaluating our strategy. Right. But I definitely think you really want to look at success, define it, and then try to identify the components of success, and then allow that to really guide your process. So, if I have an athlete who's not very confident, and his confidence is his major limiting factor, I have to really factor that into my approach. Maybe the level of detail in his programming is going to change, so that it's not necessarily prioritized around the programming details, but it's more prioritized around building confidence. If that's my number one priority, or that's my number one KPI for this particular athlete, then just accomplishing that in itself, even without some of the other variables, might be really what we need to do at that particular time. Mm-hmm. So I have to be able to be aware of that, and maybe break away from some of the traditional approaches that I've had. And same thing, you might have an athlete where mobility and neuromuscular balance is really their priority. So you have to maybe abandon some of the traditional drills that you're doing, or get away from your bias in terms of what their needs are. I really believe, Matt, you have to look at every athlete from an unbiased viewpoint, and let your observations tell you what their needs are, as opposed to getting hooked on a certain methodology and then trying to, always assume that methodology is what somebody needs. So I try to look at it from a blank palette. And from that perspective, it is a collaboration. It is a series of observations that guide you in terms of what you want to do with each athlete.
Interesting. My last question regarding the mindset side is about motivation. And when you get these athletes at every level coming to you, what's your process in motivation? Is it kind of go back to what you just said regarding the process of analyzing where they're at right now, like keeping them motivated when they're going through those 12-hour days, traveling schedules, on the plane, and those kind of things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll be the first to admit that I think motivation for me, that's not necessarily something that I consider to be my wheelhouse right now. And the main reason for that, Matt, is the group of athletes that I'm working with currently are all really highly motivated guys. And so I've sort of focused my attention on more of their technical needs, and more in terms of understanding that analysis around their needs, and how to get them the results that they need. Working in the NHL versus my private business, you do find yourself in those moments where you need to do a little more motivation, or you need to drive that. I always find my energy and my enthusiasm is a big part of that. If I'm energetic, enthusiastic, excited about what I'm doing, people want to work with people that are enthusiastic, right? So that can play a big role in the motivation. The second thing I've noticed is that information and metrics is a big deal, because sometimes people aren't motivated to do off ice work or dry land work or whatever it might be but they're competitive. And the fact that they're in the sport means they're competitive. So if I can attach a number onto what they're doing day in and day out and give them some information, there's this instant kind of buy-in, right? Because they know, hey, there's going to be a number attached to what I'm doing, and I want my number to look better than his. So I think attaching metrics to the work you're doing on a day in and day out basis automatically allows those competitive juices to create the motivation. So you don't really have to bark at guys. You don't really have to push guys, because that gets old, and I think really confident athletes, they only get motivated by that for so long. And so I think that the sports science side and using metrics as a coaching tool, as much as it is an analysis tool, I think is a big part of it, especially with the way technology is today. Athletes that I'm working with, they love reviewing their numbers, whether it's calories that they've burned, whether it's a certain outcome that they've had, speeds or distances, or a certain time that they had on a certain task, and then seeing how they compare with their teammates day in and day out. I think that's a great way to motivate athletes. And then on the other side, I think just your presence as a coach, probably what we're going through as an organization. I've had as an industry, and I've had colleagues in different parts of the world that have said this also, that the more and more we get kind of identified with information and analysis, which is a route that I think the industry is going, sometimes what happens with that is you lose the people skill side of it. So, it's still extremely important to have good coaches that have presence, that can talk to people, that can communicate, that can make an observation and work off of that observation. The age of informatics sometimes causes us to drift away from that, but I still think that those are very important characteristics. So you kind of have two worlds, colliding, and rather than one replacing the other, I always try to look at it as, if we can synergize those personal qualities and skills with the ability to analyze information and use that to your benefit, to kind of have the best of both worlds.
Interesting. So you're almost going and saying that the metrics are the component towards really, truly the motivating factor for high-level athletes.
Yeah, there's no question. I would say that 2/3 of the value that I get from the metrics are more in the coaching side of things. So feedback, discussion, education, motivation, that's really where it gets used. And then the other third is used a little more for research and learning as a coach, in terms of the value of certain things, planning, strategizing. But I actually think that feedback and that interaction with your numbers from a day-to-day basis, and in fitness and recreational weightlifting, we see these every day. They're the weights that we've lifted, right? Imagine if you had no numbers on what you're doing day in and day out. It wouldn't be quite as motivating, right? You could never set PR. You could never really accomplish anything in your workouts, right? So it would get boring after a while. And so I think just having those numbers, knowing what's going on, having people understand, hey, listen, your numbers were way down today. And then having them look at that and go, wow, why is that happening? And then all of a sudden there's lifestyle things that pop up. Oh, I didn't get a great night's sleep last night, or I haven't been eating well the last few days. And, just getting into discussion of what happens at the physiologic level that's going to allow them to have these outcomes, creating awareness around that. Those are all coaching tools and coaching applications. So I think the information is really as important as a coaching tool as it is, an analytics tool.
Interesting. That's very interesting. So kind of moving over to the training side for a moment, because I want to dive into that for a few minutes as well with you, Andy. That's obviously one of your key specialties. So, being that I'm kind of from a bodybuilding background, all listeners on here are athletes, or they're bodybuilding, or they're training, or they're fitness athletes. Do you mind explaining a bit, because you obviously work with high level, like the best in the world of athletes from a performance standpoint, correct? So when it comes to achieving, I'm going to say maximal strength, for example, okay? Can you give this could probably be a whole hour discussion on that one topic alone, but a quick analogy of maximal strength. When you're training, for example, example like Sidney Crosby, for whether it's power endurance or training or whatever it may be in your level, in a nutshell, in say a few minutes, what would you say is the key, most important thing to achieve maximal strength safely, effectively, with what you would suggest to somebody that would ask that question?
Well, I think the way I look at it, and listen, when we learn about fitness and strength and conditioning, we learn principles, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these basic physiologic principles still continue to be very valuable and important, and people aren't going to like this answer because it's not cut and dry. But the way I look at it as, what is maximal strength? That's the question that I ask. And, you can get into a long debate about what it means. To me, from a hockey player's perspective, I don't really think about strength. I think about performance in a task. So if somebody's strong on the puck, or they win a battle because of a contact, or just their ability to shoot or skate or produce acceleration, those are complex motor tasks. And there are biomechanical variables that contribute to the success of those tasks. There are pure physiologic variables like strength. But ultimately, because it's a complex motor task, the training tasks or the training applications have to be specific with respect to the type of muscular contraction, the type of neurologic output, and the type of biomechanical environment that they're in. We live in an environment sometimes where we think, okay, well, I think a back squat is a great way to develop max power. So if I can improve their performance on a back squat, I've therefore improved power, and therefore all other tasks should be more powerful. And the research and, just years of experience really argues that, right? It argues by saying, okay, well, no, you've improved your ability in that particular task, and there is going to be some carryover into other tasks, but only to the degree at which those tasks are specific in their environment or similar in their environment. So, for example, if you're talking about, hitting somebody on the ice, that's, or, creating acceleration, off the blocks in swimming, the degree of biomechanical, neurologic, and central neural specificity is going to dictate that level of transferability. So that to me is a faulty assumption that we make, that if you can improve somebody's strength under a bar or strength in a particular environment, that's going to carry over. And we see that over and over, and we make that assumption too often in the strength and conditioning world. So I made that early in my career, and the reason why I made it, Matt, was because I had improved guys in a lot of basic lifts and then not seen tangible improvements in their performance environment, and then asked the question, like, what's missing, right? Like, here are these guys that are going out training for 4 months with the hopes of creating a career for themselves, putting their trust in me, and I'm not necessarily getting them the results that they need. I think at a lower level, you see that those results automatically carry over because you're building like basic athletic traits. And as you get higher and higher up the line, whether you're a rower, a speed skater, or a hockey player, you're going to see more and more specific loads and demands needing to take place in order to see that transferability. So I asked the question, what is it that's different between the tasks that I was enhancing and the task of their sport? And I realized I needed to study the sport more. So I have to study those sports and identify, like, what's going on out there. And the problem that we have in the strength conditioning community is most people will just skip over that, and they'll say, oh, well, that's just skill. I've increased your squat or your deadlift, or I've increased your VO2 max, therefore you should be a better hockey player. And if you're not, well, that's just something that I have no control over. I've done my job. And I think I looked at it always differently, of I'm missing something and I need to learn more about the demands of the sport. And to this day, I think we still don't spend enough time studying and learning about the demands of the sport and allowing that to drive our methodology instead of going with some kind of preconceived bias, which we all have. Somebody with a powerlifting background is going to tell you need to do a lot of powerlifting applications to be good at hockey. Somebody with an Olympic lifting background will argue that the Olympic lifts are more important. Somebody with a metabolic endurance environment will argue that. So from that standpoint, a guy like Sidney, coming back to your question, power for me in his sport is, I look at acceleration, on the ice. I look at, like, coming out of turns, crossing his feet, being able to accelerate away from pressure, getting away from pressure, and then being able to, be explosive in various different types of contact situations. That's really what I look at. And so what I want to be able to measure are movement variables. So I look at his acceleration off ice or his acceleration on ice. Those are really the ways in which you predict those things. And so for me, the lifts aren't as important, because what I find is if I have increased his power underneath a bar, while that power is increasing, I'm simultaneously decreasing some vestibular capacity or some movement capacity or some range of motion, or the muscle contractile properties are different. So maybe it's a slower contraction process under the bar, but it's such a faster, more reflexogenic or more eccentric type of power being applied to his movement scheme that I'm actually increasing one variable and decreasing the next. So to answer your question, the best way to look at that power is in the sport. So how's he shooting the puck? How's he accelerating? How's he looking on the ice? How's he feeling? That to me is the benchmark. And then everything else works backwards from there, instead of looking at the gym measures in terms of our KPIs. I always think the KPIs should be very, very sport specific, and then moving backwards. And if we see a relationship, i.e. when this exercise increases, that increases, then we have, a relationship between those athletes. And usually it depends on where they're weak. And so let's say you're looking at acceleration on the ice. You have stride turnover or stride rate that becomes very important from that. You have biomechanics. So some people just don't sit low enough with their center mass. Right. So they need a little more ankle flexion, or they need to actually position their center mass differently relative to the base of support. Some people just don't have enough neuromuscular output, so not enough strength in the way that we look at it. And some people, their muscle contractions aren't fast enough, so they don't have enough sort of power or velocity in the actual muscle contraction. So if I look at the athlete and I say, here's a really strong, stable, low, very, very powerful athlete, but he just needs a little bit more speed in the muscle contraction, I may start using some Olympic lifts, or I may start using some plyometrics or something along those lines as my KPIs, as a way of enhancing that one characteristic. If biomechanics are a problem, that the athlete has tons of power, but he's just sitting in a bad position, it might be range of motion, or it might be some video analysis to see if he can actually stick those mechanics through a bunch of different transitional movements. Wow. Or if the pure strength thing, we see this all a lot. We see athletes that are really whippy. They've never really developed a foundation of strength, but they have a lot of sort of fast twitch or sort of elastic type properties. But they have a lot of movement inefficiency on the ice because they're tending to use that sort of elastic component of muscle energy as opposed to actually staying in a good stable biomechanical position. And for those athletes, we might use more strength KPIs. So at the end of the day, that the father KPI is what they're doing in their sport, and then we work backwards and then define the various components that are most important, because we know that they relate to the weak components in their actual environment.
This is like music to my ears. I could sit here and listen to you for the next 2 hours. It's this is going great.
Worst way to answer your question, right? Because everybody wants to know, hey, what's the magic exercise? What do I need to do? And the answer is it depends. It depends on the situation. But at the end of the day, if you're a pitcher, and your biggest thing is you need more speed, in your fastball, that's the KPI, right? Yeah. So I can't just say, well, I need to improve your bench press, and then once I've done that, you're all set. That's how we think traditionally, right? Because strength coaches aren't designed. We don't learn how to assess a baseball, or assess, a pitcher's technique, or we don't know how to assess somebody hitting a baseball, or we don't know how to assess somebody skating. We don't learn about sport mechanics. And I think that environment is really interesting. I heard an interview recently with Vladimir Zatsiorsky, who was talking a little bit about the culture in Russia and Soviet Union in the 80s. And he talked a lot about how all their education was centralized, and they spent a lot of time. So the students were not only getting their formalized education, but they had a lot of they actually got to observe coaches of national team athletes, and they would see programs, and they would actually observe that concurrent with their education. And that's a tool I find in North America. We really look at things on a theoretical basis first, and then very few young coaches get to have access to what the athletes are doing in their day-to-day environment. And it actually took me 7 or 8 years into my career before I actually started watching athletes in their environment long enough to be able to really, make some connections of what they actually need to do, and then have that influence backwards into my methodology. Before, it was just sort of, hey, plyometrics are good for you, right? You want to get more explosive,
Exactly.
Let's lift a few things, just boxes, right? That's got to help. But, I think that will help any young athlete who's just improving general fitness and some basic motor skills. But once you get to the Sidney Crosbys of the world, or, the really elite athletes, or the Patrick Chans or the Matt Duchenes, all of a sudden, these are good athletes and already have a base of physiologic development that need more specific things. And for some, it's more stride length, and for others, it's a little bit more power. And, you really have to know what those priorities are and know where the gaps are in order to make them more successwe'll.
Well, I can tell you now, Andy, I'll be getting you back on the show, because I already have 10 new things here I'm going to be putting down on my paper to talk to you about.
That's awesome.
We're going to go to our peak 5 questions, because I could be here for the next 2 hours with you. You have to go in as well as myself. So peak 5, Andy, I want to go into the first question. If there was someone in your life that was influential or was a coach or mentor to you, who would that be?
You know what? It's really hard to pick. I've gone a little bit of a different route as a strength and conditioning coach, and a lot of my methodologies are a little bit self-taught. But I've read a lot of books of people that are influential and met a lot of people. I think growing up in PI and not really having other strength and conditioning coaches around there, I I had to kind of define a lot of my own methodologies, and I just sort of, that's how my brain works. It's a little easier for me to create some things. There was a gentleman actually that grew up in my hometown and came back to live there shortly before I kind of got kind of into my own career. His name's David McCachran, and Dave was an Olympic gold medalist in bobsleigh, and had trained with a lot of elite level sprinters and bobsledders, not only in Canada but in Europe. And that was pretty cool as somebody growing from a small town, just to actually witness a really high level Olympic athlete, let alone an Olympic gold medalist, train, and how he trained and the level of detail that went into it. So I felt like that was really important to me. And, I ended up kind of going in my own direction and developing my own methodology, but that was just influential. I think it was really, really inspiring. And I think since then, there's been numerous people that had come into my life, whether it's a PT that I've met or different people where I've learned methodologies and, taken them and then created my own application of it. But yeah, probably not so much one person as there have been many people, coaches and different professionals I've met along the way.
Well, this next question I'm going to be dying to ask you because you're like a ferocious reader. So what is your most influential book? It might take you half an hour to figure that out because you probably have read so many of them, eh?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. There's a book by a guy named Charles Leonard it's called The Neuroscience of Human Movement. And it's really interesting to me. I've always loved movement. I've always been really interested in it. But one thing I've learned for sure over the years is I'm a big believer in specificity and transferability. So, I know for sure if you're rehabbing a back injury, for example, the type of muscle contractions, the level at which the muscle contractions are occurring and the environment that it occurs in can vary so many different ways. Like you can look at eccentric versus concentric strength. You can look at a more dynamic or reflexogenic type of contraction versus a static contraction. It can be predictable or not predictable. You can be in an unstable environment. You can be a little more unilaterally dispersed in your center of mass or twisted or rotated. And then there's all this different freedom of movement at the pelvis and the spine that you have to factor in as well. Do you have a stable environment or do you have an unstable environment in terms of the mechanics? So many different variables. And so for me to really understand all of that, I really had to understand the nervous system. And it was intimidating for me as a young strength and conditioning coach. So I found this book was a really simple way of breaking down some really complex terms and what they mean, and then just really understanding the basic anatomy. What's funny is that, if you had given me that book in my undergrad, I would have just probably scratched my head because I don't really know what it would all be for. But after I got, into my career 10 years and pick up a book like that, I see these immediate applications and understanding, okay, well, when you produce that type of movement, it's happening at this neurologic level. And that's why, we can't really induce a response or an adaptation because we're doing it at this level. So understanding the differences, all the different types of movements, and then how you can create afferentation to various central structures was really, really valuable. And that was a book that just broke down the basic anatomy to the point where I understood it a lot better. So that was, I'd probably pick that one. There's so many, but next time I'll pick a different one.
That sounds perfect. What's your most influential quote?
There's a bunch of quotes out there that are really cool, but there's a really good one that kind of sits in my home office at home. But it's a quote by Albert Einstein, and it is, I'll make sure I get it correctly. He said, "Great spirits are always violently opposed by mediocre minds." Oh, wow. And I'd say that there is numerous times where I wanted to do something different or new, or I had a different way of approaching something, and it had some success, and there were a lot of people that just are uncomfortable with that, right? So you have a little success, or you try to do something your own way, and people try to knock you down, or people try to challenge you, and it's a cool quote because I think it's important for people to know that that's just part of the process. That's part of everybody's process. Totally. And have later on met great people, whether it's Pete Lemon at the University of Western Ontario, who had some different or controversial things, or different academic people, whether it's Stu Phillips or Bill Kramer. I love reading about them and some of the things that they've published early on that probably were met with some criticism John Berardi's another great guy who did some different things in the industry and got met with, critics and you just hear that more and more often. And who better of a man to explain it than Albert Einstein, who, is now considered this great person, but was, rejected from different universities. His theory of relativity, I think, got rejected, when he applied for grad school. I think it was in Switzerland where he originally did that. So there's, I think it's just important to know that that's part of the process. And I would convey that to a lot of young minds out there because it's important. It's important. We need young people to have the courage and the authenticity to begin their journeys with a slant of their own creative genius. And that should never be discouraged. I think it should be encouraged, challenged, certainly, but never to the point where it's wrong just because you're different.
I love it. Number 4, Andy, if you could tell your 20-year-old self, and do you mind sharing your age, by the way?
Yeah, I'm 39.
39, there you go. 39 years young, guys. Under 40. He's a young guy. What would that one lesson be you would tell yourself 19 years ago? What would that lesson be?
Man, I would... interesting. A 20-year-old Andy running around, I probably thought I knew a lot more than I really did at that time. But, I think at that time it's, I shared something recently on a social media post just about, when I was kind of growing up in school, I have sort of my own way always of learning, and I always like learning, but I like learning through exploration. So I was never good at memorizing the answer to a question or memorizing a methodology. I kind of always like to create my own or reconstruct my own based on logic. And it kind of clashed with the school system a little bit. And that was never something that got encouraged. So I very often, came to a conflict with exploring my own learning styles. And one thing I've learned about people and athletes is that everyone's a little different in terms of the way that they learn. And I think it's important as a young person to really know your strengths, know your skills and your talents, and know the gifts that you bring to the world and embrace those and really follow those. I very often thought some of the styles that I had from a learning perspective were hindrance at times because they didn't fit into the box. And so, and now, now that I'm a little bit older, I can look back and say, wow, no, those have really helped me gain a certain perspective. So that's kind of the big thing I would say is just, stay on track with what feels authentic and what feels right and true to your heart, and really try to nurture those and put some structure around that instead of falling into somebody else's structure. When you clash with your instructors, that means you're a little bit smarter than them, by the way, Andy. Yeah, I don't know if I was smarter than anybody, but I definitely felt that I definitely feel that learning is an exploration process, and curiosity in general is a quality that's very common to a lot of great contributors to various industries. And so I think it's just important to nurture those things. And I was curious to a fault when I was younger, and that sometimes, I was probably at a stage in my life when I was 20 years old that I didn't really get that and was trying to find my way. And in the end of the day, some of the best decisions I've ever made in my life were decisions that a lot of other people were encouraging me not to do because they didn't seem as streamlined. And, back then, trying to get into the industry that I'm in now, I remember going to school. I mean, in my undergrad program, I was one of the few people that was really looking to train athletes, talk to a lot of different students, and I would try to, say, hey, this is kind of what I want to do for a career. And people would look at me strange because it wasn't a career that was really evident to people. And now it's a very, very popular career that a lot of people are looking to do. Probably the majority of people coming through the industry want to work with athletes and work in sports. And so, anyways, it sometimes we get discouraged, by limited minds, but I love that Albert Einstein quote. Number 4, Andy, what's one thing, if there were no limits to your contribution in the world, what would that contribution be? Well, I think it comes back to what we said before, finding your gift, to give and giving that gift. And I think the big thing for me is I love breaking down. I love problem solving. So I love looking at complex or challenging problems and then trying to break them down into simple ways for people to understand, and then communicating that back to people so they understand them better. And then I think just caring for others in general. My dad was a chartered accountant and my mom was a nurse, so probably inherited a little bit of both qualities, right? A little bit of problem solving and a little bit of just lifting people up, finding people that are vulnerable or that are putting themselves out there or taking a chance and trying to pursue their dreams and just connecting with them and trying to inspire them, motivate them, have them believe in themselves. I think just the combination of those two things is what feels right to me, and definitely feel aligned with my life's purpose when I'm fulfilling those two things in one way or another.
You can tell just talking to you, you're like radiating with energy and just knowledge in what your craft is, man. I absolutely just love this. Well, this is awesome, man. Like, literally I could talk to you here and really dive into so many topics on training and psychology and obviously your background. It's really fascinating. And I know we're kind of grinding down to the last part of the interview here. So I want to ask you, Andy, was there anything you want to add to this interview or add that we haven't chatted that you'd like to share with the listeners?
No, I don't think so, Matt. I think you had some great questions to guide me through the interview. But yeah, probably the one thing I would add is that I've definitely have noticed in our field, whether it's strength and conditioning or fitness, people are just so passionate about learning these days, especially the mediums in which you can learn. I mean, podcasts, videos, webcasts, looking at stuff on YouTube, reading articles. I mean, there's just so much information out there, and that's awesome. I mean, people have really developed this way of learning, and I think the more people can share, the more abundant I think it is. And so I think it's important for us, just as professionals within the industry to feel less threatened by sharing of information and involving one another, and realize that alone, we can only do so much, but together you could really accomplish some things, and it's a lot more fun and a lot more abundant to do it that way. So I just think it's important for whether it's young students or accomplished people in the industry to spend time and to pull together resources to help the next wave of people coming through learn and learn appropriately. That's
fantastic. Well, Andy, this has been fantastic. I got to say, man, I love your small town energy, and obviously you win the award as the beginning of as the most patient guy ever. So Andy, where can we find you? Like, you're kind of a secret kind of ninja warrior because you're over there in Toronto, you're in Pittsburgh, you're all over the world training these high level athletes. So where's the ninja? Like, where can we find this ninja?
You know what? I'm just in the process of actually launching a website for the first time in my 20-year career. So So yeah, I've stayed pretty hidden, and for the most part, my the clientele that I have are pretty private, and they're not so into putting stuff out there. But I think I just reached a stage in my career where I want to share more. So I'm doing a little bit more of that, and I'm going to start writing a lot more, probably through my website, which is just o'briensport.com. But as of right now, on Twitter is an easy place to find me. It's Body by O'Brien, and I try to tweet out some relatively useful things every once in a while if I can. And but really interested in writing more, and probably going to find more of me in the months to come.
Well, you're a wealth of knowledge, Andy, and I just want to say thanks, bud, for your time today and your time over there, just to give us all this valuable gems of wisdom you share with us today. And I got a whole list of more stuff I'll be asking you probably next time. I can guarantee you that. So looking forward to having you again, Andy, and thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate that.
All right. Thanks, Matt. It was a pleasure. We'll be talking to you soon.
You got it, bud.
Okay. Cheers, pal.